There is a person in your life, or there has been one, or you are in the middle of trying to leave one right now, who exhausts you in a way that no amount of rest fully repairs, whose company leaves you with the specific, flat depletion of someone who has been giving from a place that was not designed to be endlessly given from, and with whom every conversation seems to end at the same place. You more empty, and them somehow unchanged, somehow replenished by the exchange in a direction that you are not. You have known for a long time that something about this relationship is not right. You may have said it to yourself, may have said it to someone else, may have circled back to it in the private inventory you take of your life at the moments when the cost becomes undeniable. And yet you are still here, still in the relationship, still showing up, still extending yourself toward a dynamic that you know is taking more than it is returning. And the question that you have never been able to answer satisfactorily is not whether you should walk away, because you already know the answer to that, but why you cannot, why the knowing and the doing remain separated by a distance that willpower alone has never been able to close, why every resolution to end it or reduce it or protect yourself from the worst of it seems to dissolve under the specific gravity of actually being in the room with that person again. The conventional answer to this question, the one offered by the boundary-setting genre of self-improvement that has dominated the popular conversation about draining relationships for the last decade, is that the difficulty is about love, or loyalty, or habit, or fear of conflict, or fear of being alone. And while none of these are entirely wrong, they are all surface answers to a question that operates at a much deeper level. The actual answer, the one that is rooted in the depth of Carl Jung's psychology of the unconscious, and that explains with precision why the draining relationship has the specific gravity it has, is both more uncomfortable and more liberating than any of those surface explanations. You cannot walk away from people who drain you because they are not only taking from you, they are also holding something of yours, something in your psychological shadow, something you have disowned or suppressed or refused to acknowledge in yourself. And the relationship, however costly and however damaging, has become the place where that exiled part of yourself is the most visible, the most activated, the most impossibly present. The walk away that does not work is the one organized entirely around rejecting the other person. The walk away that actually frees you is the one that begins with the understanding that what you are leaving is not just them. It is the specific unconscious arrangement that has been keeping both of you in place. And the shadow work required to break that arrangement is not about managing them at all. It is about retrieving what has been living in that relationship on your behalf. Today on Quiet Power, we go to the real depth of why draining people are so impossibly difficult to leave, and what actually needs to happen in your interior before the leaving becomes genuine. This is Quiet Power, where we take the experiences that most people navigate on instinct and popular advice alone, and bring the depth of the best available psychology to what is actually happening beneath the surface. What you are about to understand about why you cannot walk away from people who drain you, will not give you a technique. It will give you the precise understanding of the unconscious mechanism that has been keeping you in place. And that understanding is the only thing that actually dissolves it. Subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because this channel is building the most complete psychological map available for every significant human experience. And this video is one of its most personally important pieces. The first thing to understand about the shadow work of walking away from draining people is what Carl Jung meant by the shadow, not in the popular misconception sense of the word, which treats it as a repository of the worst parts of a person, but in the precise clinical sense that Jung developed over decades of analytical work with hundreds of patients, and that the subsequent century of Jungian clinical practice has refined into one of the most practically useful and most empirically supported frameworks in depth psychology. The shadow, in Jung's formulation, is not the dark side. It is the disowned side, everything that the developing person's social environment communicated, explicitly or implicitly, was unacceptable, threatening, or too dangerous to express, and that the person therefore relegated to the unconscious, not because it ceased to exist, but because making it conscious felt more costly than keeping it hidden. The shadow contains what did not fit the persona, the social mask, the acceptable self, and its contents are as varied as the social environments that required the suppression. The anger that was too threatening to express in a family that organized itself around the avoidance of conflict, the needs that felt too shameful to acknowledge in an environment that taught that having needs was weakness, the ambitions that felt too large to claim in a context that read largeness as arrogance, the grief that had no space to be felt in a household that maintained its functioning by not feeling. And crucially, and this is the piece that the popular treatment of the shadow almost always omits, the shadow contains not only what is genuinely dark in the person, but also what is genuinely luminous, the creativity, the authority, the passion, the directness, the self-assertion that the social environment taught the person was too much, too threatening, too incompatible with being loved and safe. What determines whether something enters the shadow is not its moral quality, but its social cost, whether expressing it threatened the person's belonging, safety, or connection to the people who mattered most. The relationship to the person who drains you is operating within this shadow architecture in a very specific way that Jung's concept of projection illuminates. Human beings cannot see their own shadow directly, because by definition, it lives outside the range of conscious self-perception. But they can see it externally in other people, particularly in the people who produce the strongest emotional reactions, the most persistent engagement, the most impossible to account for connection. Projection, in Jung's framework, is the automatic, unconscious process by which shadow material that cannot be held internally is experienced as belonging to another person. And the specific form of projection that operates in draining relationships is not simply that you see your shadow in the other person, but that the other person's actual characteristics and behaviors activate, resonate with, and hold your shadow material in a way that makes the relationship feel psychologically necessary, even when it is clearly damaging. The draining person is not a random selection. The unconscious, which has its own intelligence and its own agenda that is not aligned with the conscious ego's preferences, selects the people who will most effectively serve as the external stage for the shadow material that the person needs to confront. And the specific exhaustion of the draining relationship is, at this level of analysis, the exhaustion of a person who is conducting the most important psychological confrontation of their life in the Jung language of an interpersonal dynamic, rather than in the language of interior self-examination, which is why the confrontation never ends, why the same patterns recur, regardless of the specific person, and why simply removing the person without understanding what they were holding on your behalf does not produce the freedom that the removal was supposed to provide. The second layer addresses what specific shadow material draining relationships are most commonly holding, the particular contents that the unconscious has arranged to be activated in the dynamic, and why the specific ways you feel in the presence of the draining person are not simply the consequences of their behavior, but the specific footprint of what your shadow is doing in the relationship. The most consistently documented shadow content in draining relationships is what might be called the suppressed need, the person's own legitimate need for reciprocity, for care, for their own energy to be attended to and replenished, which was suppressed in early relational environments that rewarded self-sacrifice, caretaking, and the subordination of personal need to others' comfort. The specific guilt that arises at the thought of walking away, the guilt that has prevented the departure more reliably than any other factor, that transforms every clear decision into a negotiation and every boundary into an occasion for shame, is not simply an emotional response to the potential harm to the other person. It is the precise consequence of having internalized the message that your own needs are not legitimate, that prioritizing yourself is a form of moral failure, that a good person continues giving regardless of what the giving costs. The shadow work that the draining relationship is requiring is not the work of learning to manage the other person. It is the work of reclaiming the legitimate selfhood that was exiled in the act of becoming the person who gives without limit, of confronting the specific internal belief that to have needs is to be unworthy of the connection that the giving was sustaining, and that the connection, at whatever cost, is more necessary than the self it is costing. The second shadow content is the projection of rejected aspects of yourself onto the draining person, which is the piece that produces the most confusion and the most resistance when it is named, because it involves recognizing something that the emotional logic of the situation actively resists, that the very qualities in the draining person that most exhaust, frustrate, and anger you are often the qualities you have most systematically denied in yourself. The person who drains through demands and neediness is reflecting the neediness that you have, suppressed in yourself so thoroughly that you no longer experience it as a need, but only as a character flaw in others. The person who drains through their refusal to take responsibility is reflecting the part of you that also wants to be released from responsibility, but cannot allow itself that want. The person who drains through manipulation is reflecting the shadow of your own unacknowledged desire to have things go the way you need them to go without the cost of directly asking for it. This is the most difficult piece of the shadow work, not because it is not true, but because recognizing it can feel like an exoneration of the draining person's behavior, which it is not. The recognition is not a verdict about their behavior. It is an inquiry into your interior, into what about their behavior produces the specific, intense, disproportionate emotional response in you that most people's difficult behavior does not produce, and what that intensity is pointing toward in your own psychology that has not yet been brought into consciousness and integrated. The third layer addresses the specific interior process that the shadow work of walking away actually requires. What has to happen inside, in the genuine sense of a psychological event, rather than a behavioral decision, before the departure becomes real and before the specific gravity of the draining relationship loses the hold that willpower and rational decision-making alone have consistently been unable to overcome. The first element of this process is what Jungian psychology calls the withdrawal of projection, the specific interior event in which the shadow material that has been experienced as belonging to the other person is recognized as belonging to oneself and retrieved from the relationship that was hosting it. This is not an intellectual recognition, though intellectual understanding is its necessary precursor. It is a felt shift, the specific experience of looking at the draining person and no longer experiencing them as the container for what you have been, confronting in the relationship, the experience of their hold on you loosening, not because they have changed, but because you have reclaimed what you had invested in them to hold. The practical method of this retrieval is the one that Jungian analysts from Marie-Louise von Franz through James Hollis have consistently described: the practice of taking back what you project onto others by examining your strongest emotional reactions to them with the specific question, not what is wrong with them, but what does this reaction tell me about what I have not yet integrated in myself. When you can sit with the frustration, the depletion, the anger that the draining person produces in you, and follow it backward to its origin in your own shadow, to the suppressed need, the rejected quality, the exiled part of yourself that their behavior is activating, the reaction changes in quality because it is no longer being directed at an external object, but is being used as a lamp shining into your own interior. The second element of the interior process is the reclamation of the identity that was organized around the role the draining relationship required you to occupy. Most people in draining relationships have constructed a significant portion of their self-concept around the role the relationship provides: the caretaker, the loyal one, the person who does not give up on people, the one whose capacity for giving is the thing that makes them valuable and worthy of connection. Walking away from the draining person means walking away from the role. and the role carries its own shadow material, its own exiled self, its own question that the person has been postponing by staying in the dynamic. Who are you when you are not the person they need? What does your life mean when it is not organized around the giving that has felt like its purpose? The shadow work here is not the work of answering these questions abstractly. It is the work of being willing to inhabit their discomfort long enough for the genuine self that the role was covering to begin, to emerge. The work of allowing the identity that was constructed in the service of the draining relationship to disintegrate, in the specific Jungian sense of positive disintegration, and of trusting that what reconstitutes on the other side of that disintegration will be more genuinely yours than what the role was offering. The fourth layer, the one that determines what the walk away actually looks like when the shadow work has been genuinely engaged, addresses the crucial distinction between the departure that is organized around rejecting the draining person and the departure that is organized around reclaiming yourself, and why only the second one produces the specific freedom that the first, however many times it is attempted, consistently fails to deliver. The departure organized around rejecting the draining person looks like every attempt you have made before that has not fully worked. You build the resolve by focusing on their faults, their demands, their failure to reciprocate, the damage the relationship is causing, and for a period, the resolve is sufficient. But you are still in the same relationship with yourself that you were in before the departure, which means the same shadow material that was activated in the draining relationship is still unintegrated, still looking for a stage on which to be confronted, still organized around the external, because the internal confrontation has not yet been conducted. And the universe, which operates with a dark humor that the Jungians have always appreciated, provides the stage, a new person with a different name and a different face who activates the same dynamic, produces the same exhaustion, and holds the same shadow material as the one you just left. Because the shadow does not care about specific people, only about the material it needs the person to encounter. This is why the phenomenon that is most consistently reported by people who have ended one draining relationship without the accompanying shadow work, the specific, demoralizing experience of finding yourself in the same dynamic with a completely different person, is not a coincidence or bad luck or a failure of judgment. It is the precise, predictable consequence of a shadow that has not been satisfied by the departure because the departure was organized around the wrong objective. The walk away that works is genuinely different in its interior quality, and the difference is not in its firmness or its permanence. It is in what the person is oriented toward when they make it. They are not oriented toward the rejection of the draining person. They are oriented toward the retrieval, the specific recovery of what the relationship has been hosting on their behalf, the reclamation of the need they had suppressed, the integration of the quality they had projected, the recognition of the identity that the role had been covering. And from this orientation, the departure is not the primary act. It is the consequence of the primary act, which is the retrieval. And because it is a consequence rather than a primary act, it has a different quality, quieter, less dramatic, less organized around the emotion of rejection, and more organized around the simple recognition that the relationship has finished its work, that what it was holding for you is now yours again, and that continuing, it serves neither you nor the growth that you are now capable of conducting without the external stage the relationship was providing. James Hollis, whose work on the midlife encounter with the unconscious remains the most practically useful application of Jungian psychology to adult developmental experience, wrote that we are not here to fit in, to be well-adjusted, to be safe. We are here to be real. And finding what that means requires the willingness to engage everything that the defended self has been avoiding. The draining relationship has been one of the most demanding and most effective instruments of that engagement your unconscious has arranged. The shadow work of walking away from it is not the work of escaping the engagement. It is the work of completing it, of taking everything that the dynamic has shown you about the exiled parts of yourself and bringing it back into the light of conscious self-possession, so that the next relationship you enter is not organized around the shadow's agenda, but around the genuine self that the shadow work has made more fully available. Here is what I want you to hold from this video. Not as a permission to stay in a relationship that is genuinely damaging you, but as the most honest account available of what actually needs to happen before the leaving is real. The reason you cannot walk away from people who drain you is not a failure of your willpower or your intelligence or your knowledge of what is good for you. It is the specific, documentable consequence of a psychological arrangement in which the draining relationship has become the external stage for the most important interior work of your life, and the shadow material that the relationship is holding will not release its gravity simply because you have decided to go. The work is interior. It begins with the question that most people who are trying to leave a draining relationship never ask, because the emotional logic of the situation points entirely outward. Not what is wrong with them, but what is mine in this? What have I been encountering in this relationship that I have not yet been willing to encounter in myself? What am I afraid I will find in my own interior if I stop looking at theirs? That question is the beginning of the only departure that actually works, the one that leaves you genuinely free rather than simply relocated to a different version of the same dynamic. This is Quiet Power. Subscribe if this video has given you the framework that the surface-level advice never provided. Share it with one person who is trapped in the specific gravity of a draining relationship and cannot account for why the knowing and the leaving remain so far apart, because this video is the answer to that question, and they need it more than they need another article about boundaries. And leave your answer in the comments. What is the specific quality in the draining person in your life that produces the strongest emotional reaction in you? And can you see, honestly, where that quality lives in your own shadow? Until the next one, look inward before you look outward, retrieve before you reject, and know that the departure that frees you is always, in the end, a return to yourself.